Alright guys, so here what I'm going to be doing is I've drawn lines that I need to cut out on the bandsaw. My goal for this is I'm going to be cutting tapers onto these legs. The tricky part is they're different tapers for different parts. Alright, so right here what I'm showing you is that I'm going to be leaving 3/8 of an inch on this specific part of the taper, and that the taper is going to be starting a 1/4 inch above the mortise. Um, as we go, you'll see different parts of the legs have different angles and different lengths, so it gets kind of confusing, but this is the base process that I'll be using for all of them. So here, I showed you the line, and you can see it next to the blade. I'm just going to be, it doesn't have to be on the line, I'm just trying to remove the bulk of this material. The reason for doing that is as it gets to the taper, or as I start using the shaper, if there's too much material, the cutting head is going to kind of grab the wood and rip chunks of it off. So we want to remove some of it, so it's only really taking off like 1/8 of an inch or so at any given time. It'll make it a much nicer finish. Alright, so right here, this is the jig I'm going to be using. It's basically a template made out of MDF, and it'll help me hold everything down. So that part I just pointed to, that's what I cut on the bandsaw. And I'm going to be clamping this down, and the real goal of using the jig is that so I can get the same cut on all the pieces. So those 3 boards I just pointed to, those are used to register the piece. They maintain the angle and the starting position of each of the legs. That way I can get the same cut. Alright, so the view you have right here, that little bit of material that's hanging off the edge, that's the only thing that's getting cut using this setup. So again, we remove some of it on the bandsaw to make it an easier job. And this is the shaper where I'll be doing the work. The red piece that's in the middle of the table, that's the actual cutting head. Below that is a silver bearing. That's what's going to guide the MDF template along the way so it can't go past the bearing. And you're going to always feed it against the direction of the cutting head. Alright, so now that I've done that first pass, here is what that cut that I'm going to be making this on each of the legs. Here's a good idea of what it looks like. It's a nice clean cut, whereas the bandsaw one was rough. The shaper makes very clean and final cuts. It just needs some sanding after this and it's good to go. So at one end it goes from 3/8 of an inch, and then where the cut ended, it's back to the full 3/4 of an inch thickness. For these legs, all of the cut that I'm doing right now, those are all going to be the same angle, which is nice. As we get to other parts, it's different angles. So I'm going to fast forward through, and I'll slow down certain parts and show you what's going on there. Alright, so I've finished all of the first grouping of the legs. So those were the mahogany ones. They were all one length. Now I'm moving on to a set of teak legs, and you'll see here that the mahogany ones are shorter than the teak ones. So I've had to make some adjustments, which I've done off camera, to the jig. So that backer block that I'm pointing to was in that other set of screw holes to the right. I had to move it further back because this leg is longer. Like I said before, the current cuts I'm making are all the same angle, so the only adjustment that needed to be made was the length of that initial stop block. So from where I'm pointing right now, the mortise up to the top, again, that's the same angle. When we go down to the bottom half, those are all going to be different angles because they're different lengths of cuts, so that's going to be a bit more complicated. Alright, so here is just to show you guys again that the angles for the tapers on the top of each leg are exactly the same, because the mortises are the same distance from the top of each leg. Now we're going to be switching into marking out the lower tapers for the face. So here I have 3 different lengths that I'm working with, just so I can have different heights for my plant stands. So what I'm going to need to do is the same cuts basically that I did for the top of the leg, where I'm cutting off part of the face down to 3/8 of an inch. It's just now they're going to have different lengths, which means the angle of that cut is going to be different. So each time I cut one of these on the shaper, it's going to need adjustment to the jig, which is going to take a while. Alright, so here I'm kind of just showing you the measuring process for how I went about creating all the marks. Again, it's 3/8 thickness for the final piece. Here we're going to be using the tri-square to get a straight line all the way across, so both sides are the same, so it doesn't matter as much which side of the leg I draw all my marks on. Alright, and same as when we were doing the tapers on the top, it's going to be a 1/4 inch from the bottom of the mortise is where it starts. So here I'm just trying to line that up and reconfirm that size, because I believe when I was doing it I couldn't remember what the measurement was, because for some reason I decided not to write anything down. So once confirming that it was a 1/4 inch from the bottom, I'm measuring that 1/4 inch out, and then again I'm going to use the tri-square to draw a straight line. That straight line I'm going to then use as a reference point to connect that bottom marker that I made, the 3/8 thickness all the way at the bottom of the leg, to this new mark that I'm drawing right now. That will give me a rough idea of how much material I need to bandsaw off. And again, I don't need to cut directly to the line, I just need to cut the majority of that off so the shaper doesn't rip and tear pieces. Alright, so I've got my marks all set out, and this is what the jig looks like right now. The problem that you might notice is the clamps aren't on very well. Here's a shot of just showing how much material is going to be removed in total. But like I said, the clamps aren't really positioned well, so they're barely touching the wood, which means it's not going to make for a very safe cut. So I'm going to need to adjust that. Those little red heads that are on the end of the clamps, those are what need to hold the material down. So right here, this one's barely caught at all. It's got some pressure. And the other one, it's pretty decent. For this one that I'm pointing to now, I'm showing that's the line that I drew. You need to be very aware that the clamp's not sticking out past that line. Otherwise, the cutting head's going to hit it, and that's going to be pretty much a disaster. So that's something to pay attention to. Alright, so I've moved the clamps. They're all closer now. The stop blocks didn't move. So now we have a good bite on both of these. And remember that clamp to the right, that needs to make sure it's not crossing the line that's being cut, because you really don't want that cutting head hitting metal. You're going to ruin both the clamp, the template, the cutting head. It might even rip the clamp out, and then it's going to go flying across the room. It's not a safe thing to have happen. So now what I'm doing is I'm transferring that mark of what I need to cut to the other side. I'm going to use the jig to make sure that the line is in the same spot on all of these pieces. That way I can go back downstairs to the bandsaw, and that's the line I'll be cutting. Again, I'm going to have to change this jig for each of the legs, so it's a work in progress. Alright, so now we're back down on the bandsaw. Again, just to remind you, this is the line I'll be drawing. I do not need to go all the way to the line, and I really don't want to go all the way to the line. So long as I leave a little bit of material, the shaper is going to clean that up. If I leave too much, then the shaper you run the risk that the shaper is going to grab a large chunk and rip it out, and then it's not going to be nice looking. If you take too much off, the shaper is not going to have anything to clean up, so then you're going to have a lot of work sanding that, and then your tapers aren't going to be the same anymore. So again, you want to leave about 1/8 of an inch of material off your line. That way the shaper can do its job. Alright, so we've got all these legs cut out on the bandsaw. So here's just a quick look at the bottom of the template to see how much material is getting cut off. It's not a lot. Remember, we don't want to be cutting a lot off at once because it's going to lead to a lot of tear out. So everything is clamped on. We'll be running all of the lower tapers on the mahogany pieces, then switching the jig for the other two and doing the same cuts. So it's the same process, run it against the rotation of the bit, that way you have more control. If you go with the rotation of the bit, what's going to happen is it's going to very easily try and pull it out of your hands. The machine's running very fast, and each time it goes to cut, it wants to grab into the wood, so always go against the rotation. And then here is just a quick peek at what the tapers on the face look like. So that's what all the legs will look like on the face. Then we're going to come back and do similar cuts on either side, so it gets a nice, elegant look to it. Okay, so here we have all the pieces laid out. All the tapers on the front faces are now done. So that's the first step. Now we're going to be marking out where I need to cut on the bandsaw to do these side tapers. So again, I'm drawing my 1/4 inch line below and above the mortise because that's what I'm using as a baseline. I'm registering all my cuts off that. And then I'm going to be figuring out how wide I want the top and bottom of each of these legs to be. So they taper to a 3/8 thick on the thickness. So now I need to figure out left and right. Originally, these were 1.5 inches wide. So as I'm looking at it, the first thing I do is just mark the central point. That way I know I'm going the same distance from either side. Because I was also figuring out how wide I wanted them to be right now, it was an easier way rather than say, all right, let's take off 1/8 of an inch. Do I like that? We can start at the center point and say, all right, let's add some material to either side and see how thick that is. So what I decided on was adding 3/8 to either side. That way it tapers to 3/4 of an inch. I went with that number because that also matches the initial thickness of these legs. So just some mirroring some of the dimensions. So here you can see that was the 3/4 of an inch. Once I have these marks, I can now go from that 1/4 inch line below the mortise to connect these new lines that I just drew. What that will show me is what the actual shape of this taper is going to look like on the sides once I cut it. One thing I realized after I had gone and drawn all of these lines is that I drew them on the wrong side. So like right now I'm doing everything visible on the flat side of the leg. The problem is when you're cutting something, you need that flat side to be against the table. Otherwise, you're not making a very safe cut. So even though I'm drawing out all the lines on these sides in this next section of the video, I had to go back and redraw them all on the other sides, which took a while, but end of the day, it wasn't terrible. But having that flat side down is going to make you have, one, a more accurate cut, and two, a safer cut. There's less vibration where the piece can rock back and forth. It's flat and secured against the table. And the table's also going to reference all the angles. That way you know you're cutting what you need to cut. But here you can get a quick idea of what that taper is going to look like, and the general process of how I did it. Just remember, I did it on the other side of the legs. Now we're back down to the bandsaw. You should be familiar with this process by now. I'm showing you here that I redrew the lines on the tapered side because, again, I need that flat side to rest against the table. Think about the bandsaw, it moves downward, so if there's no material supporting it, it's going to be trying to force that into the table as you cut. Again, I'll remind you again, you don't want to cut directly on the line. You want to cut about 1/8 of an inch off, and that's 1/8 of an inch off into the waist, not onto the good side of the line. You're always going to be aware of which side is your waist and which side you're keeping. So here I'm going to go through and cut all of the tapers on just the top of the leg. The reason for that, again, is the tops and the bottoms have different angles based on the lengths. So I can't go and just cut these all with the jig I have. I'm going to cut the top ones first, and then I'm going to go back, adjust the template for each size leg, and cut them again that way. Alright, back to the shaper now. So here the jig looks a little bit different now. I've added a third clamp, I've changed the positions. Only 2 of these clamps are going to be working at a time, and those 3 blocks I'm pointing to now, those are all registration blocks. So that's what's going to keep the angle. I'm going to set each piece in there, and then once I'm done, I'll be able to move those registration blocks, flip the piece around, and use the left and the middle clamp to do the opposite side. So this is a bit of a process, and it takes a while, but again, using these jigs and templates, that's how you get repeated results, and that's how you make everything consistent, and how you can do things safely. Alright, so now I've finished those initial cuts on the long teak legs. Now I've switched to the medium-sized legs, the mahogany ones. So again, I don't really have to readjust the template too much. I'm just moving one of the registration blocks. That way it's actually catching where the mahogany is. So I just use double stick tape to put these on. It's quick, it's easy, and it's strong enough where I'm not putting huge force against it, so it's just going to hold. I'm just lightly butting the piece up against it. So here you can see it's just too small. There may be a 1/4 inch thick or wide strips of tape, but they'll, like I said, they'll hold the material in place because I'm just using them to place them, and then the clamps are actually what's doing all of the holding. So the pressure's all on the clamps. Before I run anything, I make sure that the clamps are secure, that the piece doesn't wiggle at all. If it wiggles, that means as it's being cut, it's going to be vibrating, leading to inaccurate and potentially dangerous cuts.